Welcome, everyone. It's a delight to have you here today for our fifth installment of the six-part series, Forget Me Not, How We Memorialize. This has been an absolutely delightful program that Jane Hutcheon first proposed to me as part of, well, the different kinds of family storytelling projects that we're involved in as Project Kin. It began in part as a consideration of those moments of storytelling when we lose a loved one. So often, as I know it was for me, there's a rushed experience of trying to sum up a life for a purpose. And then what is that? And how is that? And how is that all changing? And these are questions that you'll find us exploring in this fabulous series. You can see all past episodes at projectkin.org/forget me not hyphenated. And today we have a very special guest, which I'm going to defer on, and I'm going to defer to Jane to make the introductions. Thank you so much, Jane. James, welcome.
Thank you, Bob. It's lovely to see you as always, and lovely to see our audience there too. And I'm going to introduce you to James R. Hagerty, also known, or better known, I guess, as Bob Hagerty. So, Bob, welcome to our little monthly, really, discussion on the idea of memorializing. Bob, how are you?
Good. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, for those of you who don't know, Bob spent many, many years working for the Wall Street Journal as their official senior writer, and he wrote about 800 obituaries then. He's still pumping them out and writes daily for publications, including the Wall Street Journals and the New York Times. Bob, for most of us here, this is a family history organization. What is the worth of an obituary in the context of family history?
I think they can be incredibly valuable. I'm sure all genealogists have noticed that, but many of them are very inadequate, and that's sort of my mission, is to try to persuade people to put more effort into telling the stories of their lives. And start early on that project, and don't leave it just to your friends and family.
When you say inadequate, what do you mean by that?
Well, in the old days, in American newspapers, anyway, there used to be obituaries for almost everybody. They were written by staff reporters, and they were at least, a short summary, professionally done. But then newspapers staffs shrank, and today newspapers only write about people who are very famous. And so most people, when a family member dies, are advised by the funeral home to write up something. They can go onto a website or maybe be inserted into a newspaper. And if you look in American newspapers and probably other newspapers around the world, most people get a few sentences. And when I look at those little items, which are basically just a list of names and dates, I think, is that all? But really, that is all that people will find about you 30 or 40 years from now if they look for most of these people. And to me, that's not really enough.
So how do we encourage? I mean, first of all, that's not necessarily the family's fault, though, is it? If we are having to give something over in an organization or a company only has space for 200 or 100 words, what can we do about that?
Well, the first thing we can do is start early, and try to take charge of our own stories. Now, this little note in the newspaper, it may be only a short note that goes into a newspaper, but there should be more that could be shared with friends and family. And even for the short notice, there should be an attempt made to show a bit of this person's personality, what he or she was up to. The problem is that, most people, they die, they haven't really done anything. The family is in a rush, and they put something together that's pretty vague, often inaccurate, and to me, totally inadequate. So that's why I'm hoping that people will think about this when they're younger and start putting down some of their favorite stories. Uh, because you may think that, oh, who cares? But someday your your grandchildren, your great grandchildren may care a lot, and who knows who else might care a lot. You know, when Samuel Pepys started writing his diaries, what, 500 years ago, uh, he probably didn't imagine that it was going to be a huge audience for them. Uh, but he thought it was interesting, so he wrote it down. And it is interesting. When Anne Frank started to write her diary, I'm sure she didn't imagine that people would be reading it more than 80 years later. But she thought, there's some interesting things I could put down here. Maybe I'll want to know about this later. Maybe somebody else will want to know about this later.
I'm going to go into the nitty-gritty of an obituary in a moment, but you've written nearly 1,000 obituaries of what I would describe as public and perhaps successful personalities. What distinguishes these lives from the rest of us?
Well, I think I do tend to write about people who were successful. And the number one thing I notice is that most of them were very optimistic people and resilient people, which is not a great surprise, but it is striking that people who succeed tend to really believe in themselves. They have a lot of confidence. They know they may stumble, but they figure they'll get someplace in the end. I find that a lot of the people I write about happen to be Jewish. So part of that is because we're often writing these days about Holocaust survivors who were uprooted, ended up in different countries, and very often were very successful. And those are always very interesting stories. I'm writing often about people you never heard of, but who had very interesting lives. People who probably didn't expect that they would ever be written about in a major newspaper.
So do you think
that
there
shows me
is...
that people who think their lives are fairly ordinary often have had very interesting lives.
I was going to ask you, do you think there is such a thing as an ordinary life?
Well, I think, no two lives are the same. I think every life is interesting in some way. I'm not sure I've ever met a person who couldn't tell me anything interesting. Except for, very few people just don't want to tell you anything. But you can always find some topic on which a person is passionate, and they know something that very few other people know. Obviously, some lives are a lot more complicated, a lot more famous, a lot more surprising than others. But I think almost everybody has a story to tell that is interesting. It's a question partly of, do you want to tell it? And there's some people who simply don't want to tell it. They are not interested in the past. They only want to look forward. But I think most people can be coaxed to tell these stories and will find that they actually enjoy telling them.
What is the most out there thing that you have said to someone in order to convince them to write their obituaries or their stories?
I'm not sure I have anything really out there, but what I always tell them is, I wish my dad had done something. My dad was a newspaper editor, and he, despite being a newspaper editor, he didn't really want to talk about his own history. And we tried a little bit, but he wasn't really too interested in telling us about his past. And when he died, we wrote an obituary about him. And we had all of the basic facts right, but we didn't convey his personality at all. And later on, I just realized how little I really knew about my dad. And there were things I wonder about him today, like, why did he decide to become a journalist? How did that happen? That was something that was very fateful for me, but I don't think I ever thought of asking him that. So it's a regret. And I find that a lot of people have this regret. You know, when you're a teenager or when you're in your 20s, often you're just not too interested in your parents. You just accept them for what they are. They're a given. But usually when you get a bit older, you get more curious. And I think the older you get, the more curious you are. And so if you have teenagers who don't really seem too interested in all the great stories you could tell, that doesn't mean that they will never be interested.
That's a very good point. So when it came to writing your dad's obituary, can you tell us what happened and how you went about that?
Well, really, I think my mother and sister did it mostly because I was in another country, uh, and they just assembled the facts quite quickly and did it. I don't think they gave it a lot of thought. Uh, and I probably most people thought it was, you know, perfectly fine obituary. But now that I'm an obituary writer, I see how much more can be done. And even at the time, I knew we should have done more. And so a few years after that, I sat down with my mother. She was 78 years old at the time. And I interviewed her for several hours and took notes. And I wrote up about 25 or 30 pages on her life because I knew she wasn't going to do it, even though she was quite willing to talk about it.
25 or 30 pages. That's a good life.
Yeah, there was a lot to say. And, you know, at the time she was 78 years old. And I thought, this is a good time to do it because how much more can happen? But actually, a lot more has happened to my mom. And I've had to do a lot of updating.
Yeah, your mum is a bit of a well,
She,
she's been viral, hasn't she? She's
yeah,
gone
she went
viral
viral.
before.
She wrote a story that went viral on the internet and ended up being interviewed on national TV and meeting Tony Bourdain and having a book published. So a lot happened to her in her 80s. Uh, so my advice to people is, you know, get started early on telling your story, but be prepared to update.
Yeah, I think the update is a really good thing. It's something we could almost get to regularly every 10 years just to update our stories.
Certainly.
Bob, I really like in your book, you suggest that people ask themselves some preparatory questions when they're undertaking something like an obituary. Shall we talk about that a little bit?
Sure.
Do you remember those questions off the top of your head?
I do. Yeah, this was, you know, when I started writing obituaries, I had to kind of think about what am I really driving at with these stories I'm trying to do? And I thought, well, you could sum it up in three questions. What was the person trying to do with his life or her life? And why? Something that's rarely asked or told. And how did that work out? But equally, those are questions we should ask ourselves every day or every week, maybe every month. Uh, what are we trying to do with our lives? What am I trying to do? And why am I trying to do that? And is it working out? Because you know, you might find out that you need to revise the narrative a little bit and change your trajectory.
Yeah, I really like that. So, what were you trying to do with your life? Why? And how did it work out? And would you say that most of your obituaries do manage to answer those questions?
I think on the first questions, mostly. On the second question, sometimes. Uh, that is a tough question because if you can't talk to the person, you usually can't find that out. You ask their children and they don't know why. Why did dad go to dental school for 10 years and then become an organic farmer? I say, oh, that's a good question. We never asked him. But why is very interesting to me, and how. Uh, and then how did it work out? To a large extent, you can often tell that, but not entirely, because it's not just a matter of how much money you made or what was your, whether you were a CEO or a vice president or uh, a flunky. It's sort of, were you happy with the way things turned out? You know, what were you happy about? What were you not happy about? And what did you learn along the way? So those are things I like to get And I rarely get them when the person has not written about his story or recorded an oral history or have been interviewed extensively. If you're just taking it secondhand, it's usually not very good. It's usually pretty vague.
What do you mean by taking it secondhand?
If you're just asking the children and the friends, they don't really know. You know, they've heard a lot of stuff, but they only kind of half remember it.
So, in that situation, because I've had that happen to me lately, I've interviewed the son of someone, and I felt that something didn't quite ring true with what I was told. It's just a hunch. I don't have proof of that. So, what would you
Right.
do in that situation? Would you just say, I spoke to the son, and this is what they said?
Yeah, I do talk to family members, and if they say something really interesting, I include it. If I if they say things are just very predictable or seem doubtful, I don't include it. I talk to as many people as I can because sometimes people do have a very good story, and that will shed light on the personality and what the life was like. But, you know, I think a lot of
How
people will think, oh, I told my kids all about my life and my friends. They know about this. But you have to think deeper. You know, when you told them those stories, were they taking notes? Probably not. They only really remember maybe half of it at best.
do you think obituaries are something that have a sort of timeliness about them? So, for example, the New York Times started a series where they kind of retroactively, if that's the correct word,
Mhm.
began to do obituaries about people whom history had forgotten about.
Right, right.
And there was a lot of commentary in the comments section about whether that was, whether you were adding different layers onto things because something happened 50 years ago or 20 years ago. And I wonder what your take is. Does an obituary have to be when someone is recently deceased?
No, not really. I mean, I think what the Times is doing is a great idea. A lot of people were overlooked just because it was a different world, and people thought, well, the men do interesting stuff, and the women are just in the background. They're trying harder now to tell some of those stories, and the stories are just as interesting now as they would have been then. And the one problem is the word obituary with what I'm talking about, because when you say obituary, most people are not really sure what you mean. They think it's probably just some little note that's going to announce somebody's death. And so that, of course, is something, it's a piece of news which should appear as soon as possible. And so if I tell them, well, you should write your obituary, they'll say, well, what's the point? I mean, that's just a little note. What difference does it make? But what I'm really talking about when I say obituary is, yes, you might have a little note, but let's have a lot more than that. And so I'm really talking about your life story. And that will be as interesting 50 years from now as it is the day after you die.
Yeah.
It'll be more interesting because we'll,
So, with all of our life stories, I guess we have the possibility to offer people a blow by blow account of our many decades that we've lived so far. And I'm sure you and I and many of us here have read those sort of blow by blow accounts. How do you how would you advise us to make obituaries a little more interesting, if possible?
yeah. So yeah, well, you don't need blow by blow. I mean, some people like to record everything, and that's fine. But most of us don't, and most people are not going to have time to read 5,000 pages on somebody's life. Uh, most biographies are way too long that you find in the stores. So you have to think about, what was really interesting. What were some of the turning points in my life? What were some of the unusual things that happened to me? What do I have to say that other people don't know about? Uh, you don't want to cover everything. Uh, you can cover a lot if you like, if you have the time and the inclination, but you should try to think about what are the most important things and make sure to include those. The things that, your children and your friends might learn from, or people you don't even know might learn from 100 years from now.
So, what are some of the more interesting obituary tasks that you've had in your career?
They're all really interesting. There was a time when I was told that a woman who was very well known as a gadfly, an asker of very tough questions at annual meetings of public companies in the U.S. Somebody told me that she had died, and I spent about a week confirming that she had died because she didn't have any immediate family. And I didn't want to go on hearsay. And finally, I managed to talk to somebody at a bank who was familiar with her financial records and said he was willing to tell me, on a background basis that yes, we know she's dead. And so I could go with the story. I was the first to have this story. And I ended up being the one to break the news to one of her former husbands when I reached him. So that was interesting. I once wrote an obituary on a woman who was 116 years old, who I'd happened to meet when she was a mere 111. And we had a great conversation that day. And she was somebody who was a librarian in schools in North Dakota, somebody totally unknown. But it was an interesting story, and it was probably one of the most popular obituaries I ever wrote.
Wow. So did you hang on to it for another 5 years until she passed, or
well,
what
when I
did you do?
interviewed her, I didn't have any thoughts of an obituary. I just happened to meet her, and we had a good chat, and I wrote down some notes at the time. And then when she died, it was actually a news item because she was one of the oldest people in the world. And I happened to meet her. So I was really glad that I happened to meet her. And she was an example of how people who have never traveled or never lived 100 miles from their birthplace, who have worked as a librarian or some other more or less invisible job, still have a lot to say and could tell you a lot about how things were in the past. And really, she could tell you a lot about how to live your life.
Well, we must look that one up. You'll have to give us
It's
a
in my
link
book.
later.
I included it in my book.
Well, we'll also try to get people a link in case they don't have your book yet. Whitney has asked a good question. She says, when you're writing an obituary, are there any big no-nos?
Getting things wrong. I try to be very careful. It's hard to get everything right. I think, when you're writing about yourself or a family member, you have to think about whether you want to go into certain things. There may be things that would hurt other people, and you have to decide whether it's important to include this or whether it would be needlessly painful to somebody. You have to think a little bit about fairness. I'm sometimes writing about people who are controversial. I have to keep in mind that they are not there to defend themselves. So I try to take that into account. I'm probably going to have to write something that is not very positive, but I try to include whatever they have said or what their friends say about the situation. And I try to make sure that I include any of the more positive elements of their lives.
So what is, in your own mind, what is the difference between, for example, a written eulogy and a written obituary?
I think, well, a eulogy is really usually a tribute. So it's probably going to be more positive. Although I think it's notable that the best eulogies almost always contain some element of memories of a person's more peculiar habits. And these always make everybody in the congregation laugh. And I think that's very important because people, they laugh at the memory. And I think they all feel a bit relieved and better because they realize that this person's not really totally gone from us. We still enjoy these memories. We're not going to forget them. And we can still laugh. So that's why humor is useful in a eulogy and in an obituary. And we have to, I mean, an obituary written by me in a newspaper is going to be more factual and analytical and not concerned with necessarily making somebody look better. I'm trying to just make them look as I believe they were. Whereas families often think I should be writing a tribute. Well, when they write their own story, that often is a tribute, and they only include the positive. Although I always tell people an obituary is not an application for sainthood or a nomination for sainthood. You know, let's try to be somewhat realistic. Let's admit that not everything went perfectly.
So tell us about the obituary you've prepared for you.
Okay. Well, again, I wouldn't really call this an obituary because it's not something that's going to appear in a newspaper. But I've written quite a bit about my life, and I got started because I kept telling everybody else they should do this. So some years ago, I just started putting together things I remembered. And I looked at it the other day. I think I told you it was 55,000 words, but it was really only like 35,000, which is still quite a bit. And that got me up to around age 50 or so. And I've been so busy lately, I haven't gotten beyond that. But it's an attempt to put things down while I still remember them, in case my kids do get curious at some stage about why I did this and that. And it was also just an interesting exercise for me to try to remember things and try to make sense of them. There have been psychological studies showing that people tend to feel better after they write about themselves, because you sort through some of the bad things that happened and get a better understanding why they happened. And I think it helps you sort of let go of resentments and let go of obsessing about why this went wrong or why that went wrong. It's kind of venting.
Yes, and it's also I think they call it narrative therapy. It's very widely used in a lot of rehabilitation, and it's actually fascinating because, you know, those of us who enjoy journaling and probably did it many years before narrative therapy became a thing, just thought it felt good to I call it downloading. And I find I have to do it before I go to sleep because I tend to ruminate about things while I sleep. So downloading is quite a good thing to do. In terms of, you should take us through your sister's obituary, because that was a very poignant and lovely story that you mentioned in your book as well.
Yes, my sister was dying of what we call ALS, or what I think you call motor neuron disease. And by the time she was just a few days from death, and could no longer really even talk, she somehow communicated to me that she wanted me to write her obituary. This was before I was an obituary writer. And so I said, yeah, I'll do my best. And I sat down and I couldn't remember all of the stages of her career. So fortunately, I could look on LinkedIn and I could get the names of her various employers and when she was in Tokyo and when she was in Hong Kong. And I wrote it down as best I could. It came to maybe 800 or 900 words. And my brother-in-law was going to put it in the local newspaper in this tiny town. They were living on a ranch. And they told him there was going to cost extra if we didn't cut it down by about a couple hundred words. And I said, oh, that's fine. You know, I'm a journalist. I'm used to that. People that always cut me on the bottom. But my brother-in-law said, no, every word. And he was happy to pay extra for it. But I realized, of course, afterwards that this was really not a good portrait of my sister and that we could use a lot more. And she could have done so much better. I did give a eulogy for her, which I had to ask somebody else to read because I knew I'd break down in the middle of it. But in that eulogy, I remembered more of the personal things about her. And that was a lot better. So, I mean, the moral of that story is that it's a shame my sister didn't start earlier. I didn't start earlier. We didn't really think about it until it was too late. She had a lot of great stories.
Mm. If you are suggesting this process to people, and your book is a wonderful guide and has so many stories of fascinating individuals that we can almost use as inspiration, perhaps even as kind of templates, if you like. The process of conducting oral histories with people, what have you found surprising? I mean, journalists ask questions. We sit down and we usually ask people, start at the beginning and, you know, we finish at the end. But what have you found interesting that's worth passing on to a group of family historians about the process of conducting oral history?
I've found that a lot of people do at some point sit down with their mom or their dad or grandpa or uncles, so and so, and they ask questions and they record them. And that's a great idea. But they could do a lot better. For one thing, they often do this on some kind of a device which 10 years later is totally obsolete and nobody knows how to use it anymore. So if you do that, make a transcript and put it on paper and make sure that somebody keeps the paper, takes care of that. And then go through it and figure out what are the gaps here? What will people not understand 50 years from now? Because when we're talking, we'll say, you know, when I was with Joe at the lake, you and I understand who Joe was and what lake we met. But in 50 years, they won't know that. Or, you know, when I went to UMC for my XYZ degree, you know, you have to explain those. But more important, you have to think about your interviewing technique when you sit down with somebody, because a lot of people who are not professional interviewers think that an interview is just asking a question, writing down the answer or recording the answer, and then going to the next question. But if you do a lot of interviewing, you realize that when you ask people a question, they rarely answer it. They might answer part of it. And then they meander off all over the place. And I let them meander because when they talk about other things, it's often fascinating stuff I never would have thought about asking. But then at the end, I have to steer them back to the original question. Say, but what about this? And sometimes you have to ask the same question 3 or 4 times in different ways before you really get a clear and satisfactory answer. So it's something that takes a lot of patience, some forethought, and maybe you don't want to do it all in one go. You maybe want to do it in several sessions so people don't get tired of it. Another thing is when you're interviewing somebody, you want to think about, how am I going to start this? You don't want to start with something really difficult. You know, like, why did you and I'll probably get divorced? Because then they'll think, well, they're just interested in the negative stuff. You want to start with things that they really want to talk about before you get to things that might be more difficult. And you want to ask questions in a diplomatic way. You know, you don't say, why are we always so grumpy? Say, well, what were the things that frustrated you the most? So think about your questions ahead of time, ask them in the right order, and don't take a non-answer for the final answer.
So give me an example of a non-answer that you can turn into something useful.
Okay, I mean, you say, like, what did your father do for a living? They'll say, well, he was in sales. Okay, well, Sales of what? And so they might say, well, consumer goods. You have to, you have to say, well, what consumer goods? You have to keep drilling down. Or they say, he spent his whole career at XYZ Corporation. Well, what did he do there? Did he own it? Or was he the janitor? Or was he a vice president? What did he actually do? So there are a lot of, it's just a matter of getting people to be more specific and to remember that not everybody has the same context.
For those of us who are caught short or caught out because something happens very quickly, are there, I suppose, minimum standards in your book about what we should aim to have, given that we couldn't sit down and have the whole oral history interview?
Yeah, in that case, I think you just have to do the best with sort of secondary sources, memories of people who know the person. And sometimes those will be quite useful. You can look in old newspapers sometimes and find details you didn't remember, wedding stories or awards that people won when they were in third grade. Or you're often surprised what little scraps you might find if you do a thorough search of archives. Sometimes if somebody's lived through a historic event, you can explain a little bit about what that was like. Somebody grew up in the Depression. What was it like for people? And you do your best.
Marcy has asked whether obituary writing is a career, which is a really interesting question, because people who write obituaries seem to be extremely passionate about this craft, because it is a craft. But I'm sure you didn't go to a job interview as an obituary writer, did you?
No, not at all. I mean, when I was a young man, I wanted to be a journalist. The last thing I ever would have thought was that I should be writing obituaries, because I thought obituaries were just these little formulaic notes. But I discovered when I was living in London and reading the British papers that obituaries could be very entertaining, and even if you had never heard of the person. And so that made me think this would be a fun thing to do. And when the opportunity came along, I volunteered. And it's really the best job I've ever had. It suits me. It wouldn't suit everybody, but it suits me because I'm interested in history. I'm interested in people's motivations and their psychology.
There are quite a big, I suppose, field of obituary writers in the world. I mean, I guess all big newspapers would have at least one or two people who wrote obituaries. So is there sort of like a whole club of you, or do you meet online like we're meeting online here, to share your tips and tricks?
There really are not that many anymore. There is an organization in the U.S. of obituary writers, which hasn't met in recent years, but it is, there's a website. I think it has maybe 50 members, but only a few of them are really full-time newspaper reporters. Some of them are people who just do this when people ask them to help. In the old days, every newspaper would have people writing obituaries, but today most cannot afford it. It's really only the very big newspapers in the US that have a full-time obituary writer. I think the New York Times probably has a dozen people on its obituary staff. The Washington Post has probably 4. The Wall Street Journal, 4 or 5. Used to be 1 when I started 10 years ago. And most other papers, they will have people who do it when it's needed. Whoever happens to be around that day will do it.
Oh, that's interesting, because I
think
assumed
there are career opportunities because a lot of families would like help. And there are people out there who just offer to help people either after a death or before a death to prepare. So I'm sure there are a fair number of people who make a living that way.
I really like that idea of offering that as a service to someone, whether it's a paid service or not, but helping out people who are not necessarily trained storytellers to tell the best story of their loved ones. So I think that's
Right.
a lovely thing to do. I wanted to ask you about some of the more, I suppose, controversial obituaries. Not, I haven't found any that you've done, Bob, but I remember seeing a little while ago. I think there was one about an Australian author who wrote The Thornbirds, and someone had mentioned her size for some reason. And then there was a Sinead O'Connor obituary where someone had had been quite critical of the quality of her voice. And what happened in these instances was that the public reacted very strongly. Well, what do you think it is about a writer that chooses to almost turn something like an obituary into a critique of work? Is I've never quite understood why that happens.
Um, I think I just try to tell a true story. I happen to think Sinead O'Connor's got a great voice, so I don't think I probably would have brought that up. But if I was writing about Sinead O'Connor and let's say I was writing about Bob Dylan, I would certainly have a section about how a lot of people thought his voice was really terrible. But then I probably note that some people thought his voice was very moving and worked very well for the right kind of song. Um, I once wrote an obituary about a business person, and I mentioned that his son had been convicted of executing a horse as part of an insurance scam. And this was something that was publicized coast to coast because it was such a bizarre crime. And people were furious with me for including this in the father's obituary. They said, well, it wasn't his fault. He didn't do it. It's his obituary. But to me, if you've lived through something in your family like this, it's worth a mention because that would have a big effect on you. And I was not writing a tribute. Some readers think it should be a tribute, and they won't be happy if there's anything critical in there. Other readers will say, I want the real story.
That's a really good point. There's also we've spoken on this forum before about what happens when, for example, there is a second partner after one partner has died, and in the process of the family grieving the second partner, there's information that needs, for some reason, people feel need to be edited out to fit the new narrative. Have you ever had a sort of controversial incident like that when you've tried to create an obituary that the family itself tries to rework?
Oh, definitely. I mean, families where there have been multiple marriages and children with different parents, there are sometimes competing narratives. I once wrote about a businessman who had 5 wives, including, I think, 3 or 4 after the age of 70. And the family obituary, I think, acknowledged 2 of them, or maybe 3. And I had to dig out the others. And they clearly they wanted to play this down. And I didn't want to make that the whole story, but I wanted to mention it. I mean, if you're married 5 times, that's pretty exceptional, especially when several of them are after the age of 70. So I include that. I'm working on one right now about a man who had a very complicated love life, and I'm trying to decide how much of this should I go into because it could take up all of my space. On the other hand, it's pretty important to understanding him. So it's a matter of trying to tell a well-rounded story about him without overemphasizing any one thing.
Yeah, it's tough. I once interviewed a famous Australian artist by the name of John Olsen, who actually, I think John died in his 90s last year only. And he had, I think, if it wasn't three wives, he definitely had three partners. And the way I put it to him is I said, John, you've loved many women, usually at the same time. Do you know why this was? And it was,
Mm.
I just wanted to sort of make clear the fact that, you know, there had been several women, and sometimes you sort of feel embarrassed about asking people about this kind of thing. So I just tried to do it in a light-hearted way. And fortunately, I didn't put him off. He just said that was his personality, that he fell in love very easily. And whether it was one or three people, it's, you know, that's just the way, the kind of person he was. So,
Right. Well, most of
yeah.
us, of course, our misdeeds or shortcomings are never going to come out in public because we're not public figures and nobody's going to even know about those. But I think when you think about what kind of a record you're going to leave behind for your children or your friends, you should think about, are there certain things, uh, mistakes I made in the past that I want to try to explain a bit. Uh, I think it's important to admit that you did make mistakes, and if possible, to say what you learned from them and a little bit about why they happened. Uh, that's what I was trying to do when I'm writing about myself. And it's not easy, but I think, particularly where there are some wounded feelings in a family, it could be helpful for everybody uh, to have a little bit of clarity and maybe the appropriate apology or regrets. Uh, I think at the same time, I think you don't want to uh, retaliate against the people who hurt you in your story. You don't want to use your story to attack other people. Um, I would just suggest take responsibility for the things that you probably should have done differently and leave it at that. Let other people decide what they want to confess. And I would say you don't have to confess everything you did wrong because that would get tedious.
Well, we've got about just under 10 minutes to go. And in fact, I didn't invite questions from the audience because they've already been submitting questions, and there's actually two more here on the chat. But just in case you did have a question and you wanted to ask it, I'm going to read out the two questions on the chat. And then if anyone else has got questions, please do bring them forward because there's only 10 minutes to go. So Kate has said that a relative in the US recently died and an obituary was put out by the funeral home, and she wanted to know more details such as when she met her husband who's still alive and where they were married, and she wanted to hear more about the actual process. And by that, Kate, I'm guessing you mean the process that the funeral home, or that you mean the person who wrote that obituary? Could you perhaps clarify for us?
Yes, I meant I meant the very valuable experience that Bob has in his life. He's got a wealth of knowledge and information, and I was hoping to hear more about the way he did things from his point of view, rather than more than dot points about what we've been working through. If you don't, I don't want that to come across the wrong way, but I'd be happy to have heard him speaking the whole time.
Well, that's fine, but we do have this as a conversation, so that's what it is. Yeah.
Right. Well, I've only just sort of registered, so I probably wasn't aware.
All good. But Bob, do you have anything to add?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think the reason you often, when you see obituaries in a newspaper or on a website, you often are left with questions is because people have just filled out a form that forms the basis of that little note. That's what the funeral home would suggest. Give us these bits of information, and they're put down. And so that's all you get, some facts. You don't get the whys and hows, which are more interesting. One of the questions I always love asking people is, how did you meet your husband or your wife? And I find that 90% of the time when I ask that question, they laugh because they always have a favorite story about this. It seems like most people have a kind of funny story about how they met and what kind of a misunderstanding there was, or um, what a coincidence it was, or whatever. So that's always a good question. And another good question is, why did you decide to take this career path? What did you want? Why did you want to be a dentist? Did you just want the money? Or were you really interested in looking at people's mouths? It's always good questions, answers about questions like that. So that's why we need to start early and do a little thinking, and take charge of our own stories if possible. And we should also look around and realize that some people are not going to do it, and maybe we can encourage and help them.
Well, we've definitely been encouraged by you today, so thank you so much. Barb asked, she says, it sounds as though in your obituary, your rule for relevance seems to be whether facts affected the why of your second question. Is that right?
I'm not sure what you mean. When I raise those three questions, it's just sort of my overview. What would I ideally be trying to figure out as I learn about this life? And then writing about my own life, I ask myself that kind of question. So I think every life is relevant and interesting. And sometimes maybe you can't answer any of those questions, but there's still a lot of interesting things you could say. A lot of people do at some point resolve to put down their story in some form, record it or write it, but they really don't know where to start. Where would I start? I mean, so much happened. Who cares about all this? And my advice is just start somewhere. Think about something that you like to, a story you like to tell about yourself, and put that down first. At least, and then there's at least that. And at least that one story will be told correctly. And then that will cause you to think of other things. And so you can add those. And you don't have to worry about chronological order necessarily, or exactly how much you are going to do or what to include. Just start the process. And then later you can decide, how should I put this together? Sometimes people just write a series of little snippets about things that happened to them, little episodes or anecdotes. And then maybe at the end of each one, they'll put a little life lesson. And that's fine. But you might want to go further and put it into some kind of logical order, or have some kind of an overview. You can do it really however you want, but just start early and get as much done as you can. Don't try to do it all in one weekend or one day, because you'll get bored with it. And you'll get through age 40, and then you'll say, for the rest of your life, and so on and so forth. And then, then I retired, and that was it. You want to do it in little bits, and try to think of interesting details, and try to come up with the most interesting stories you have. And another good idea is, once you get something down on paper, ask a friend or a relative to look at it and find out what they find is important, interesting, what other questions they would like you to answer, what doesn't really make sense to them and could be clarified. And maybe ask them about, what do you remember about my life? What did you think of me when I was 7 or 10 or 20? What did you think was important about me?
It sounds like you, apart from these sort of preparatory questions, your process of getting information about people and their lives each time is quite different depending on their own circumstances. You don't have a ready template or a set list of questions that you go into.
I do. I mean, I'm very chronological when I'm interviewing somebody because I just want to get a picture in my head. And so I will start at the beginning and say, what day were you born? What was your full name? Where did you grow up? What were the names of your parents? Where did they come from? What were their occupations? And don't just tell me it was sales, tell me what they actually did. What were your early jobs? What were your hobbies when you were a kid? Were you a good student or a bad student? And then how did you get onto this particular career path? Why did you decide to go to college or not go to college? And how did you meet this person who you married or lived with? And when did you have kids? And what was that experience like? So I do I'm pretty chronological if I'm starting with somebody whose life I don't know anything about. But if you're writing about your own life, you might not feel like being chronological. You might just feel like I'm going to start somewhere. I'll tell you this story because I think it's important, and then I'll see what else I decide to add on to it. But other people who are methodical might just say, okay, I'm going to start at the beginning. That's what I did when I wrote about my life. I wrote, my mother gave birth to me on a cold and rainy morning in Minneapolis in July 1956. And then she had a cigarette. Because in those days, that's what you did after you gave birth. You gave yourself a little reward. And they let you smoke in the hospital.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, well, look, that has been such an exciting conversation. I really do enjoy your insights into the craft of obituary writing. And of course, for anybody who wants to know more detail and many more fantastic stories of life stories of humans, you should look out Yours Truly by James Robert Bob Hagerty. And we really appreciate you joining us today. So thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Bob, and thank you all for your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so incredibly helpful, especially for an audience like this, where so many of us really rely on these obituaries as factual documents that we build from in our research to who, what family and everybody connected to each other in towns and whatnot. I love the insights about obituaries versus eulogies that has been part of an ongoing part of this discussion here, and the facts, but also the stories. It's not what is your story, but what are your stories? And that, breaking it down can be so helpful to all of us. It's a thrill. We will take this recording and add it into the Forget Me Not series at projectkin.org, Forget Me Not. And I want to thank all of you. Please feel free to continue the conversation in the digital version, which will be out as a recording emailed to our subscribers within a couple of hours, depending on what happens for me. And I will, with that, pause the recording and thank you all so much for coming.